My name is Vivian Ashford, and I believed I had built something unbreakable. On paper, my life was the kind other women referenced in conversation, not with envy exactly, but with a particular admiring shorthand. The townhouse in Georgetown. The career I had spent a decade constructing, brick by careful brick, as a senior financial analyst at one of DC's most respected consulting firms. And the husband who made every room feel calmer just by entering it. Ethan Ashford. Architect. Quietly brilliant. The sort of man who remembered the names of waitstaff and made everyone feel considered. We had been married for 8 years. We did not fight dramatically. We did not make scenes. We were the couple our friends called steady, and I had worn that word like a medal for years. Steady meant permanent. Permanent meant safe. I was 37 years old and I had never once questioned whether the foundation beneath me was real. Then my father died. And in the soft, disorienting weeks of grief that followed, while I signed papers at kitchen tables and nodded at explanations I was too exhausted to scrutinize, something shifted beneath the surface of my marriage. I didn't feel it then. But it had already begun. Grief does something interesting to perception. It narrows your focus to the immediate, the logistics of loss, the phone calls, the casseroles arriving at the door. The rest of the world continues at a remove, like watching traffic through frosted glass. That was how I missed the early signals. Ethan began working late. Not dramatically, not every night, just often enough that the shape of our evenings quietly changed. He had always been home by 7. Then 7 became 8. 8 became 10, twice a week, with explanations that were reasonable, detailed, and somehow never quite specific enough to revisit. A new client. A difficult deadline. A design revision that required his personal attention. He started leaving his phone face down on surfaces. Every surface. Kitchen counter, bedside table, bathroom shelf. A small, consistent inversion I noted but filed away as nothing. He mentioned a woman named Celeste, once in passing, then again 3 days later in a different context. A developer, he said. Demanding. Particular about specifications. I registered her name the way you register weather. Noted it. Moved on. But I had spent 12 years in financial analysis, and I knew something about pattern recognition. Patterns don't announce themselves. They accumulate. And the accumulation had already begun. My father, Raymond Coles, had been a man who expressed love through preparation. He had built a small commercial real estate company in his 30s and spent the next 25 years growing it with the patient discipline of someone who understood that wealth was not an event, it was a practice. He did not drive an expensive car. He did not take extravagant vacations. He invested in property, in carefully managed portfolios, and in a trust he had spent 3 years structuring with his estate attorney. When he died of a sudden cardiac event in March, he left me the entirety of it. The trust was substantial. Not extravagant, but genuinely life-altering. Real estate assets, diversified holdings, a liquid component representing decades of quiet discipline. Ethan had handled the estate paperwork. I had let him because I was grieving, because he was my husband, and because I trusted him the way you trust the floor, without thinking about it, because it had never given way. He suggested we consolidate the trust's advisory structure. Simplify oversight, he said. I had signed where he indicated, across 3 separate documents, on 3 separate afternoons. I had not read them carefully. My father had always said, read everything twice. That single failure, trusting a flaw I hadn't tested, was the thread that would eventually unravel everything. I didn't know it yet. But I would. It was a Tuesday morning in September. Ethan had left for the gym before 6, which was new. He had never been an early riser. His tablet sat on the kitchen island, screen still lit from a notification he hadn't dismissed. I walked past it the first time without looking. The second time, I glanced down. The preview showed a name, Celeste, and the first 11 words of a message. Last night was perfect. She really has no idea, does she? I stood very still. The kitchen was quiet. Morning light came through the window at its usual angle, completely indifferent to what I was feeling. I picked up the tablet. I opened the thread. There were 43 messages. Hotel confirmations in cities Ethan had claimed were solo work trips. Photographs of wine glasses, a woman's hand on a restaurant table, a balcony view I didn't recognize. Wire transfer confirmations to an account registered to a company called CEL Holdings. And then one message, near the bottom of the thread, that stopped my breathing entirely. Once the trust clears to the LLC, we won't have to keep anything quiet. We can just start. I set the tablet down exactly where I had found it. I walked to the window. I watched the street below. I did not cry. I made a decision. Here is what I understood in the minutes that followed. Ethan was not simply having an affair. An affair was a wound, painful, survivable, a thing that left marks but not craters. What I had just read was something more architectural. A plan. A timeline. An infrastructure of deception built while I was standing inside it, believing myself warm and safe. The trust. My father's trust, the sum of 25 years of deliberate discipline, was apparently moving toward an LLC I had never heard of, in a transfer I had never authorized. Or had I? The documents I had signed during the weeks after the funeral surfaced in my memory like evidence at a second reading. What had they said, precisely? I was exhausted. I had trusted him. I nodded at the language he described as routine. I went to my home office. I opened the fireproof cabinet. I removed every document related to my father's estate. I read them, truly read them, for the first time. By the time I finished, my coffee had gone cold. One document contained a provision granting Ethan expanded administrative authority over trust disbursements under certain qualified conditions. The language was precise. Almost surgical. No grieving widow drafts language that precise by herself. Someone had helped him. I closed the cabinet and thought carefully about what kind of woman I intended to be in the days ahead. I decided, a very quiet one. Ethan came home that evening with a bag of groceries and the effortless warmth of someone who believes himself undiscovered. I kissed him hello. I asked about the gym. He said good. I asked about work. He said it was complicated, a client pushing back on revisions. He said it with the fluency of a man whose daily life no longer requires effort. I made dinner. We ate. He poured wine. We watched 40 minutes of a documentary about Japanese architecture, and he made observations I would have found charming a week ago. I laughed at the right moments. Inside, I was absolutely elsewhere. I had made a decision in the kitchen that morning that I intended to honor completely. I would say nothing. Not today. Not next week. Not until I had built something so documented, so irrefutable, that when I finally acted, there would be no room for his reinterpretation. He had spent months constructing a world I was not invited into. I would spend the next weeks constructing one he knew nothing about. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I ran through everything I needed. Financial records. Legal counsel. A forensic accountant. A private email address. A device he had never touched. I had always been methodical. He had simply forgotten that. Or perhaps he had never fully understood it. Either way, it was his first mistake. And it would cost him everything. Over the next 10 days, I became a student of my own marriage. I created a private email account on an old tablet I kept for travel, one that had never connected to our shared home network. I forwarded copies of every financial document I could access without triggering alerts. Bank statements. Investment summaries. The estate paperwork. A full PDF of the trust's amended administrative provisions. I photographed originals and stored them in an encrypted folder. Then I started on Ethan. His firm's project records were accessible through a shared calendar we had maintained for years. I cross-referenced every late night against the hotel confirmations I had seen in the tablet thread. Every single one matched. Celeste, I determined through careful public record searching, was Celeste Vayne, a real estate developer based in McLean, divorced, early 40s, with a recently incorporated holding company called CEL Holdings. CEL Holdings. The same name from the transfer confirmation. The picture assembled itself with the quiet inevitability of a closing argument. I was not angry. Anger is loud, and loud is a liability when you're in the middle of discovery. What I was, what I had chosen to become, was precise. A week later, I made my first call outside the marriage. To the best forensic accountant I had ever worked with professionally. Her name was Sandra Osei. She picked up on the second ring. And when I told her I needed a personal engagement, completely contained, she said simply, "When do we meet?" We met in a corner booth at a coffee shop 2 miles from my office. I handed Sandra a sealed envelope containing photographs of every document I had gathered. She reviewed them with the professional stillness of someone who had seen this category of thing before and chose, each time, not to flinch. When she finished, she set the papers down and looked at me. The administrative provision. Who drafted it? Ethan managed the estate process. He worked with a financial advisor named Jeffrey Marsh. I never met Jeffrey personally. Sandra made a note. This language is not standard boilerplate. Someone with estate planning expertise custom drafted this provision specifically to permit inter-trust transfers under a qualifying event. Your father's death would constitute that event. This was designed intentionally. I let that land completely. How much has moved? I asked. I cannot confirm without the full account history. But the transfer confirmations you photographed suggest a minimum of $300,000. Possibly more. The number was not a surprise. But hearing it spoken aloud was different from reading it in silence. How long will you need? 2 weeks for a complete picture. I nodded. Sandra, I said. This needs to remain entirely contained. No one knows I am investigating. She looked at me steadily. Does he know? No. Keep it that way until I am done, she said. I intended to. Sandra called 11 days later. The transfers totaled $387,000, moved in 4 increments over 7 months, beginning 6 weeks after my father's funeral. Each transfer had used the administrative authority provision to route funds through an intermediary account before landing in CEL Holdings. But the more critical finding was what Sandra had traced backward. Jeffrey Marsh, Ethan's financial advisor, the man who had sat across from me at estate consolidation meetings I could barely remember, had drafted the administrative provision himself. He held an estate planning certification. He was a named advisor to CEL Holdings. And he had received 2 wire transfers from an account registered to Ethan personally, totaling $40,000, in the months before my father died. He set this up before your father passed, Sandra said quietly. The provision was drafted before the qualifying event occurred. They were waiting for it. I sat with that for a long time. They had been planning this before I was even grieving. Before I had the chance to be vulnerable, they had already prepared to exploit it. Can it be proven? I asked. With the right attorney and a subpoena for Marsh's business records, yes. I thanked her. I hung up. Then I opened my contacts and dialed the name I had saved 3 weeks earlier. Diane Holloway, matrimonial fraud attorney. She had been expecting my call. I was not surprised. Diane Holloway's office was on the 14th floor of a K Street building, with a view of the city that felt less like scenery and more like a statement of intent. She was 53, precise in her movements, and possessed of the particular stillness that comes from having heard every version of this story and choosing, each time, to be useful rather than sympathetic. I handed her Sandra's preliminary report and my documentation folder. She read for 12 minutes without speaking. When she looked up, her first question was not about Ethan. Jeffrey Marsh, do you have documentation of his prior relationship with Celeste Vayne? Not yet, I said. We will need it. The conspiracy case depends on establishing that the provision was designed in coordination with the intended beneficiary. A prior business relationship between Marsh and Vayne completes the chain. What is our first move? Protective orders on the trust. An emergency injunction freezing CEL Holdings pending investigation. I want to depose Jeffrey Marsh before he understands the full scope of what is coming. I nodded. One more question, Diane said. Does Ethan know? No. She studied me for a long moment. How long have you known? 3 weeks. And you have maintained the household normally for 3 weeks? Yes. She sat back slightly, not relaxing, but recalibrating. Then we have time to do this correctly, she said. That was exactly what I needed to hear. From the morning I found the tablet message to the day Diane filed, it was 47 days. 47 days of dinners made and eaten. Of questions asked and answered with the right expressions. Of mornings where I handed Ethan his coffee and said nothing about the way my father's savings were being moved through shell companies while we discussed weekend plans. He grew more comfortable as time passed. Comfort breeds carelessness. He mentioned Celeste twice more, both times with the casual ease of someone who has stopped being careful. Once in the context of a project complication. Once as a contact who might know a good contractor for a renovation he was considering. He suggested, again, over a Thursday dinner, that we revisit our long-term financial strategy. He had a contact, he said. Someone specializing in estate diversification. He thought we were being too conservative. I asked 2 thoughtful questions. I said I would think about it. He looked pleased. I went to bed and updated my evidence log. On day 41, Diane confirmed the injunction paperwork was finalized. On day 45, Sandra delivered her complete report. On day 46, I quietly redirected 3 months of personal savings to an account in my name alone. On day 47, a process server arrived at Ethan's architecture firm at 11 in the morning. I was in a client meeting across town. My phone rang at 11:14. I let it go to voicemail. Twice. I listened to both voicemails during my lunch break, alone in a conference room with the door closed. The first message was measured. His voice had the careful neutrality of a man trying to understand the dimensions of what had just arrived on his desk. He said my name. He said he had received some paperwork and wanted to talk. He said he was sure there was a misunderstanding. He used the word misunderstanding twice. The second message was different. Still controlled, Ethan was always controlled, but underneath the composure, something had shifted. A tightness in the cadence. A fractional pause before he said he thought we needed to sit down tonight. He did not say he loved me. He did not ask if I was okay. He asked to talk, the instinct of a man assessing his exposure, not consoling his wife. I noted that carefully. I texted Diane. First contact. Voicemails only. No response yet. She replied within minutes. Do not respond personally. Refer everything to me. I returned to my meeting. I billed 4 hours. I drove home at 6:30, made pasta, set the table, and waited for the man who had spent 8 months moving my inheritance into another woman's company to walk through the door. He arrived at 7. For the first time in our marriage, he looked uncertain. I found I felt nothing in particular about that. Sit down, Ethan, I said. And he did. I did not yell. I had thought about this moment for 47 days and decided, very deliberately, how it would unfold. Not because I owed him composure, I didn't. But because composure was the most devastating thing I could offer a man who had relied on my passivity. I set the printed documents on the table between us. Sandra's summary report. The transfer confirmations. 2 screenshots from the tablet thread. Jeffrey Marsh's documented connection to CEL Holdings, labeled and dated. I watched Ethan look at them. His face moved through a sequence of expressions, calculation, recognition, and something that might have been the early edge of shame, though I could not confirm that. Vivian. Don't, I said. Quietly. Don't explain. I have the documents. I have Sandra's report. I have Diane. He still went by Diane's name. How long? He asked. Long enough. I can explain the trust structure. It was meant to be temporary. Ethan. I looked at him directly. Diane has already filed. The trust is frozen. CEL Holdings is under injunction. Jeffrey Marsh received his own notification this morning. He stared at me. I watched him understand, for the first time, that he had been operating under a false assumption for 47 days. He had believed I didn't know. He had believed I was on the floor. I waited for him to say something that revealed what he valued most. He didn't disappoint me. The money can be returned. That was his first sentence. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I do not know what I was thinking. Not even her name. The money can be returned, as though this were a billing error with a correction window, a transaction that could be reversed before it affected the relationship. I looked at him and understood something I had been circling for weeks without naming it. He had never been afraid of losing me. He had been afraid of losing access. There is a particular grief in that realization, not the sharp grief of betrayal, which I had already processed privately over 47 mornings. This was quieter. The recognition that the person who was supposed to know you best had never quite seen past what you represented. This is not a conversation about money, I said. I know that. I am saying, whatever you need. What I need is for you to leave tonight. He stared at me. We can talk about. I have been talking to Diane for 3 weeks. I am done with the other kind of talking. He left 2 hours later with a single bag. He looked, standing at the door, like a man who had designed a situation and found it somehow different than planned. I closed the door. I changed the alarm code. Then I sat at the kitchen table in the silence of my own house and felt, for the first time in 47 days, the full weight of everything. I sat with it for exactly 1 hour. Then I made a list of what came next. Celeste Vayne's attorney contacted Diane 4 days after the injunction. Her position was precisely what Diane had predicted. Celeste had no knowledge of the origin of the funds. She had understood Ethan's investment in CEL Holdings to be personal capital. She was not a co-conspirator, she was, her attorney suggested delicately, also a victim of his deception. I listened to Diane relay this without expression. Do you believe it? I asked. The tablet messages are ambiguous, Diane said carefully. She references the timeline and wants things clear, but she never explicitly names the trust as the source. What she has is knowledge that something was coming. Whether she had specifics is harder to prove. What does she want? To be formally separated from the investigation. She will provide full cooperation, every communication she has with Ethan, in exchange for removal from the fraud allegation. I thought about this. Celeste Vayne had built a life with my inheritance without asking where the money came from. That was a specific kind of willful blindness. But willful blindness was also, legally, difficult to prosecute without explicit evidence. And her communications with Ethan were exactly what I needed to build the conspiracy case against him and Jeffrey Marsh. Tell her attorney we are listening, I said. 3 days later I received 112 forwarded emails. Among them, 2 messages in which Ethan explicitly named my father's trust as the funding source. Celeste had kept everything. Neither of them had been careful enough. The case had just become unambiguous. Jeffrey Marsh retained criminal counsel the same day Diane's subpoena reached his business records. That decision told me more than anything else could. Diane scheduled his deposition for a Wednesday morning. I did not attend in person, she had advised against it, and I trusted her strategy completely by this point. I read the transcript that afternoon in my home office. He was careful. Practiced. He used qualified language with the fluency of someone who had considered this possibility and prepared for it. But he could not explain the $40,000 Ethan had transferred to him in the year before my father's death. He called it a consulting fee. 4 estate planning services rendered. Diane's follow-up, delivered in 3 words according to the transcript, was, for which estate? He had no clean answer. She pressed on the provision language. Not standard, she noted. Custom drafted. By whom? He said he did not specifically recall. She showed him a metadata trace on the original document file. The file had been created on his firm's internal network. The transcript recorded 11 seconds of silence. Diane had told me once, people reveal themselves not in what they say but in what they need time to decide. 11 seconds is a very long time. By the end of the week, Jeffrey Marsh's attorney had contacted the state attorney's office. He was preparing to cooperate fully. Diane called me with the news. I asked what came next. She said, now we let the court decide. I said, good. Ethan's professional life deteriorated with the quiet efficiency of a structure losing its load-bearing walls. His firm opened an internal review when the fraud allegation entered public court records. He was placed on administrative leave. His name disappeared from the firm's active project listings. 2 clients he had been managing contacted the firm requesting reassignment. Reputation in architecture was everything. It was what he had spent 15 years constructing, the considered professional whose judgment clients trusted, whose precision made them feel safe. Trust, it turned out, was the first casualty. His social network contracted visibly and without drama. Friends who had once included us in group dinners began scheduling around his absence. This was not malice. It was the quiet self-preservation of people who had built their own credibility carefully and had no interest in proximity to an ongoing investigation. I did not follow this closely. Not because I was indifferent, but because I had learned something essential in the 47 days of performance. Attention is finite. What you focus on grows. I had decided that what I was growing was my future, not his collapse. I focused on work. In this case, on the new apartment I had begun quietly viewing on lunch breaks. But I noted, in the margins, that the parallel life Ethan had constructed, the fresh start, the future funded by my father's discipline, was developing fissures it could not survive. Celeste had not returned his calls in 3 weeks. He was alone in a way he had not planned for. And the court date was 2 weeks away. The ruling came on a Thursday in January. I was in the courthouse with Diane when the judge delivered it, and I watched her expression shift in the way controlled people shift when something has gone exactly as planned, a small, precise relaxation around the eyes. The trust was affirmed as my sole property. The administrative provision was invalidated, fraudulently induced, the judge found, given evidence it had been custom drafted without my independent legal review and with intent to exploit a qualifying event. $387,000 in unauthorized transfers were ordered returned, with interest. CL Holdings was dissolved pending asset liquidation. Jeffrey Marsh's cooperation agreement was entered into the record. Ethan was ordered to pay legal costs. I stood in the corridor and Diane shook my hand and said a clean result in the tone she reserved for outcomes she had worked very hard to make look inevitable. I thanked her. I walked outside into the January cold. The city was grey and indifferent and completely, perfectly itself. I stood on the courthouse steps and thought about my father, his yellow legal pads, his patient compound interest lectures, the 25 years of quiet discipline he had left in my name. I had held it. Every single dollar. He would have said very little about that. He would have handed me coffee and nodded once. That would have been enough. I stood there a moment longer. Then I went back to work. My new apartment was on the 6th floor of a building in DuPont Circle, with tall north-facing windows and a reading corner I furnished with a deliberateness that surprised even me. I had not realized, until I had a space entirely mine, how much of the Georgetown townhouse had been collaborative. Furniture chosen together. Art selected by compromise. Every room a negotiation between two people's aesthetics, conducted so smoothly I had stopped noticing it was a negotiation at all. This was different. This was just mine. I bought a lamp I could never have justified in the context of Ethan's more restrained taste. I hung a print my father had given me years ago that had lived in storage because it didn't suit the townhouse palette. I filled the kitchen with exactly the equipment I used and nothing else. Small recoveries. They mattered more than I expected. My sister, Claire, came the 3rd weekend. She brought wine and sat cross-legged on my new rug and said, at one point, "You seem different." Different how? Like yourself, she said. More of yourself. I thought about that for a long time afterward. In 8 years of marriage, I had not noticed myself becoming less. It did not feel like subtraction. It had felt like accommodation, which I had always considered a virtue. But the quality of silence in my new apartment told me Claire was right. The silence had a different weight here. It felt, for the first time in a long time, like rest. And rest, I was beginning to discover, was where everything important rebuilt itself. At work, I told my team only that I was managing a personal legal matter requiring modest schedule flexibility for approximately 2 months. I said it with the tone of a woman handling something routine, which made it feel routine, which made them leave it entirely alone. My managing director asked once, privately, if I was okay. Better than okay, I said. Focused. He looked at me for a moment. The Hartwell brief was the best work you've produced in 2 years. I had submitted it the week after the ruling. There is something that happens when the energy you have been spending on concealment, on performance, on maintaining a fiction across 47 dinner tables, is suddenly returned to you. It comes back with interest. You find yourself with a surplus of clarity that wants to go somewhere. I put it into the Hartwell brief. I put it into 3 client presentations I rebuilt entirely from scratch. I put it into a mentorship program the firm had been nudging me toward for 2 years. My managing director raised the equity partnership conversation in April. I said yes before he finished the sentence. This too would be mine. Fully, clearly, unambiguously mine. No co-signatories. No advisory provisions buried in paperwork I had not read carefully enough. No one was positioned to access what I had built while I was not paying attention. The lesson my father had spent a lifetime teaching me, read everything, hold what is yours, had cost something to learn fully. But I had learned it completely. And I would not need to learn it again. He called on a Sunday evening in April, 6 months after the ruling, 7 months after I changed the alarm code on the front door. I was reading by my north-facing window, a glass of wine on the side table, the city doing its quiet Sunday things below. His name appeared on the screen. I considered letting it go. I answered. Vivian. His voice was different. Stripped of its usual professional architecture, the pleasant steadiness he had deployed like an instrument for years. What was underneath was quieter. Less certain. Ethan. I have been trying to figure out what to say for a while, he said. Take your time. I told myself it was an investment. That it would be restored. That you would not be harmed in any lasting way. I know what you told yourself. Silence. I also told myself you would not figure it out. He said it without decoration. That you were grieving, and I had time, and that you were not paying close attention. I looked out at the city. That was your biggest mistake, I said. He made a sound that was short and without humor, an acknowledgement he didn't try to soften. I know, he said. We were quiet for a moment. Are you well? He asked. The question sounded genuine, though I had learned not to privilege his sincerity. Very, I said. But I could hear, in the silence that followed, that he had not called only to apologize. He had called to ask something. I waited. I know this is a great deal to say, Ethan said slowly. But I have been doing real work. I understand what I did. Not just the logistics of it, the actual shape of what I did to you. Good, I said. I do not expect anything from you. But I wanted to ask, if there was any possibility. Ethan. He stopped. I chose my words carefully. Not because he deserved my care, but because I had promised myself that this version of me, the woman who had held 47 mornings steady, would not be sloppy with her words. I believe you have done some reflection, I said. I believe you are sorry, not for what you did, but for the position it put you in. Those are 2 different things. Silence. What you are calling to ask is not about us, I continued. It is about whether you still have access to something. The life we built. The version of yourself that could stand in that townhouse and feel solid and respected. He did not deny it. That told me everything I needed. I cannot give that back to you, I said. Not as punishment. But because it was never mine to give in the first place. That version of yourself, you built it on borrowed ground, Ethan. And borrowed ground does not hold forever. A long pause. I know, he said. He sounded, for the first time, like he genuinely meant it. I genuinely hope you find your way, I said. I meant it. But meaning it did not change anything. It simply closed the door cleanly. 3 weeks later he appeared at my building. I was coming home from dinner with colleagues, good food, good conversation, the particular lightness of an evening spent entirely in the present tense. I was reaching for my keys near the lobby entrance when I heard him say my name. He was standing to the left of the entrance in a coat I did not recognize, looking like a man who had rehearsed this moment and found the reality different from the rehearsal. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically. Something in the bearing. I should not have come, he said immediately. I know that. Then why did you? He looked at the ground for a moment. When he looked up, there was no script remaining. Because I chose wrong, he said. Every step. The money, Celeste, the way I looked at you and saw, an asset to be managed rather than a person to be held. I chose wrong and I can see it clearly now, and I do not know what to do with that except say it directly to you. I studied his face. I had spent 12 years reading financial documents for what they concealed. I knew the difference between performance and admission. This was admission. It did not change anything. Admission was not restored. Understanding your damage was not the same as repairing it. And some repairs, I had learned, were not mine to offer. I believe you, I said. He blinked. That is it. That is everything, I said. I believe you, and I wish you well, and this is where it ends. I walked into my building. I did not look back. I had stopped looking back a long time ago. The things I kept from that marriage fit neatly into my new apartment. The practical items, a coffee maker, certain books, the copper pot I had bought before we ever met and used every single week without fail. The photographs of Ethan and I were placed in a box in the closet. Not destroyed. Just removed from the walls. Memory is not the enemy of forward movement. Sentimentality is. I kept my professional instincts, sharpened to a precision I had not previously possessed. I kept the habit of reading everything twice. I kept my sister closer than before. My father's letters, which I reread once a month now. The small ritual of Sunday mornings with coffee and a window that was entirely mine. And I kept something else, something I was slower to name. The knowledge of what I was capable of when I was required to be. 47 days of performance would have broken a different woman. The daily discipline of holding information, staying composed, not reaching for the comfort of confrontation, it required something I had not known I possessed until I had no choice but to find it. Grief, combined with betrayal, combined with necessity, turns out to be a remarkable teacher. I would not recommend the curriculum, but I would not trade what it produced. My father had left me a trust. I had protected every dollar of it. And somewhere in that protection, I had discovered the thing he had been preparing me for all along. Not the money. The capacity to hold my own ground. That would not appear on any balance sheet. But it was the most valuable thing I had ever owned. Here is what betrayal taught me about love, money, and the architecture of a self. Love is not diminished by what someone else does to it. The love I brought to that marriage was real, organized, committed, genuine. What Ethan did was not a verdict on my worth. It was a revelation of his character, which had nothing to do with what I deserved and everything to do with what he chose. Money is not the story. Money is what reveals the story. It reveals priorities. Character. The specific weight of what a person values when they believe no one is watching closely. Ethan did not take from me because I had something he wanted. He took from me because he did not see me as someone worth protecting. That is not a financial problem. That is a moral one. And finally, silence is not surrender. The 47 days I said nothing were not me suppressing anger for his comfort. They were me choosing the timeline that served me best. Anger, held with discipline, becomes strategy. Strategy, executed with precision, becomes the most powerful thing a betrayed woman can hold. He thought he was leaving me for something better. He thought I was the temporary stop, steady, useful, compliant, blind. What he did not understand was that I had been paying careful attention every single day of our marriage. I was simply choosing, in those final 47 days, to let him believe otherwise. My father built a foundation and left it in my name. I defended every dollar of it. And in doing so I built something he had not left me, but had, in every letter and every yellow legal pad and every diner conversation, been preparing me to construct on my own. I built myself. Completely. On ground that belongs to no one else. I find that I am not lonely here. I am, for the first time in a very long time, simply home.